Step away from my father. Ethan Blackwood's voice cut through the emergency department like shattered glass. The corridor outside Trauma Bay 3 was crowded with nurses, patients, anxious relatives, and the sharp mechanical sounds of a hospital running beyond capacity. Monitors beeped behind half-closed curtains. Rubber wheels squeaked across polished floors. Rain struck the tall windows in silver sheets, turning the Chicago night outside into a blur of headlights and water. Naomi Brooks stood beside Ethan's father, one hand resting gently on the elderly man's shoulder. She was 30 years old, 7 months pregnant, and near the end of a 12-hour shift. Her dark blue scrubs stretched softly over the curve of her stomach. A few natural curls had slipped loose from the bun at the back of her head. Fatigue lived beneath her eyes, but her voice remained calm. "Mr. Blackwood, your father is stable," she said. "The physician will see him as soon as Trauma 2 is cleared." Ethan stepped closer. "I brought him here 20 minutes ago." "I understand." "No, you don't." His tailored charcoal coat was still wet from the rain. A gold watch flashed beneath his cuff as he pointed toward the closed trauma doors. "I was told this hospital provides priority service to major donors." Naomi's expression did not change. "We prioritize patients by medical urgency." Ethan gave a short, humorless laugh. "My family donated an entire surgical wing." And the patient inside Trauma 2 stopped breathing. The words were gentle. The truth inside them was not. Several people nearby turned their heads. A receptionist paused over her keyboard. An orderly pushing a wheelchair slowed without realizing it. Ethan stared at Naomi as though she had spoken to him in a language he had never been forced to understand. "You're telling me to wait? I'm asking you to let us care for everyone safely." His father shifted weakly on the hospital bed. "Ethan," the older man whispered. "It's all right." But Ethan did not look at him. His attention remained fixed on the nurse standing in front of him. "Do you know who I am?" Naomi glanced toward the patient's monitor. "I know your father needs his blood." Pressure checked again. She reached for the cuff. Ethan grabbed her wrist. The movement was sudden. Naomi froze. Not from fear. From instinct. Her free hand immediately moved toward her stomach, protecting the child beneath her uniform. "Let go of me," she said quietly. A young nurse named Melissa stepped forward. "Sir, you need to release her." Ethan's face hardened. "Stay out of this." Naomi pulled her wrist free. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm going to ask security to escort you to the waiting area." The billionaire looked around. He saw the watching patients, the staff, the phones beginning to rise. For a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered, the attention felt like a challenge. His pride answered before reason could. His hand moved. The slap cracked across the corridor. For one impossible second, every sound disappeared. Naomi's head turned sharply. A red mark began forming across her cheek. Her body swayed, but she caught the edge of the hospital bed before losing balance. One hand remained pressed over her unborn child. Melissa gasped. Someone shouted for security. A metal tray struck the floor nearby, scattering instruments with a violent clatter. Ethan stood there breathing hard. Then, unbelievably, he smiled. Not warmly. Not nervously. The cold smile of a man who believed consequences belonged to other people. Naomi slowly lifted her face. Her eyes were wet, but no tears fell. She looked at Ethan. Then at his father. The old man's monitor had begun climbing. Despite the pain in her cheek, Naomi stepped toward the bed. "Mr. Blackwood, breathe slowly," she said. Her voice trembled only once. "I'm still here." Security rushed down the corridor. Doctors emerged from Trauma 2. Employees surrounded Naomi, asking whether she was hurt. But she kept her attention on the frightened patient. Ethan watched in confusion. He had struck her. Humiliated her. And she was still caring for his father. He did not know that cameras had captured everything. He did not know that one phone call was already being made. And he had no idea that the woman he had just slapped was the younger sister of one of the most respected federal judges in the country. While the emergency department buzzed with anxious voices and flashing monitors, very few people truly knew the woman standing at the center of the storm. To most patients, Naomi Brooks was simply another emergency room nurse dressed in navy blue scrubs with a hospital badge clipped neatly above her heart. But inside St. Matthew's Medical Center, she was something much more. She was the calm voice family searched for when fear threatened to overwhelm them. At 30 years old, Naomi had spent nearly 8 years working in emergency medicine. Long nights, impossible decisions, heartbreaking losses, and miraculous recoveries had shaped her into the kind of nurse every hospital hoped to have. She never measured success by promotions. She measured it by the number of frightened hands she could hold before sunrise. Every morning before beginning her shift, she paused for a single quiet moment inside the staff chapel. Not to ask for an easier day, only for the strength to help one more person. Her coworkers often joked that Naomi possessed an impossible amount of patience. Dr. Laura Bennett laughed about it during lunch one afternoon. "I've never seen you lose your temper." Naomi smiled while opening a container of homemade salad. "That doesn't mean I never feel angry." Melissa, another emergency nurse, looked surprised. "You do?" Naomi nodded softly. "Every day. When children suffer. When families receive terrible news. When people forget to be kind." Melissa frowned. "So, how do you stay so calm?" Naomi looked through the cafeteria window, watching rain clouds gather over downtown Chicago. "My mother used to tell me something." Melissa waited. "People who are hurting often hand their pain to someone else." Naomi smiled gently. "I decided a long time ago. I wouldn't pass it on." Those simple words explained almost everything about her. She listened more than she spoke. She apologized even when problems weren't her fault. She remembered birthdays of coworkers. She brought homemade cookies during overnight shifts. She stayed after work whenever a new nurse felt overwhelmed. Patients remembered her months after leaving the hospital. One elderly veteran insisted on mailing handwritten Christmas cards every year. A young mother once named her daughter Naomi after surviving a difficult childbirth. None of those stories appeared on hospital awards. But everyone who worked beside her knew them. By the 7th month of her pregnancy, Naomi's supervisors repeatedly encouraged her to begin maternity leave. She always smiled politely. "Not yet. There are still too many patients." The truth was more complicated. She genuinely loved caring for people. Every heartbeat she helped protect reminded her of the tiny heartbeat growing inside her own body. Sometimes, during quiet moments between emergencies, she would gently place her hand over her stomach. The baby often kicked in response. "Easy there," she whispered one evening. "We're almost done." Her unborn daughter had already become a favorite among the emergency department staff. Doctors joked that she had attended hundreds of emergencies before being born. Melissa often leaned close to Naomi's stomach. "You're going to have the strongest little girl in Chicago." Naomi laughed. "I hope she has a kinder heart than mine." "You've already set the example." Few people ever asked about Naomi's family. She rarely spoke about them. Most coworkers assumed her parents lived somewhere outside the city. No one realized that her older brother, Marcus Brooks, served as one of the youngest and most respected federal judges in the country. The siblings had made an unspoken agreement years earlier. Marcus never used his position to benefit Naomi. Naomi never mentioned his name to gain respect. Their parents had taught them one lesson above all others. If your character needs someone else's title to earn respect, then you haven't built your own. Naomi carried those words everywhere she went, including that rainy night. Standing beside Richard Blackwood's hospital bed, her cheek still burning from Ethan's hand, she ignored her own humiliation and reached instead for the blood pressure cuff. Because in Naomi's mind, a frightened patient deserved compassion, even if the person standing beside him had just taken away every reason to offer it. It was that quiet decision, not the slap, that revealed who Naomi Brooks truly was. And before the night was over, the entire hospital would understand why everyone who knew her simply called her extraordinary. Long before the confrontation inside St. Matthew's Medical Center, Ethan Blackwood had spent decades convincing the world, and himself, that success erased consequences. At 48 years old, he was one of Chicago's most powerful real estate billionaires. His company owned luxury hotels, commercial skyscrapers, private residential developments, and multi-million-dollar shopping centers across the Midwest. Business magazines called him a visionary. Financial television programs praised his aggressive leadership. Every year, universities invited him to deliver commencement speeches about ambition and perseverance. To the public, Ethan represented the American dream. To those who worked for him, he represented something very different. Inside Blackwood Enterprises, employees understood one unwritten rule: never embarrass Ethan Blackwood. Boardroom meetings often ended with executives publicly criticized for the smallest mistakes. Junior managers rarely offered new ideas because disagreement usually meant humiliation. Even senior vice presidents carefully measured every word before speaking. Fear had quietly become part of the company's culture. Not because Ethan enjoyed cruelty, because he genuinely believed demanding perfection justified everything else. His assistant, Claire Donovan, had worked beside him for nearly 12 years. She knew his routines better than anyone. Every morning exactly at 7:30, coffee waited on his desk. Every afternoon his meetings stayed scheduled down to the minute. Every inconvenience disappeared before it reached him. Restaurant owners reserved the best tables. Hotels upgraded his suites automatically. Airlines held flights when his private security requested extra boarding time. For years, people had adjusted their lives around Ethan's expectations. Slowly, privilege stopped feeling like privilege. It became normal. Earlier that rainy evening, Ethan had been hosting an investment dinner when his 76-year-old father, Richard Blackwood, suddenly clutched his chest. His face turned pale. His breathing became shallow. Within minutes, an ambulance rushed them towards St. Matthew's Medical Center. During the ride, Ethan barely took his eyes off his father. Despite all his wealth, there was one thing he couldn't purchase inside that ambulance: certainty. When they arrived at the emergency department, nurses immediately transferred Richard onto a hospital bed. Doctors moved quickly. Electrodes, blood pressure monitors, intravenous lines. Everyone worked with calm efficiency. But another ambulance arrived almost simultaneously. A teenage construction worker suffering massive internal injuries was rushed directly into Trauma Bay 2. The emergency physician made the difficult decision every trauma doctor eventually faces: treat the patient closest to death first. It was the correct medical decision. It became the spark that ignited everything else. Ethan approached the charge nurse. "My father needs a cardiologist now." "We've already called one, sir." "I don't want him waiting. The physician is currently treating another critical patient. My family has donated millions to this hospital." The nurse answered gently. "And we're grateful. But donations never determine emergency priority." Those words echoed in Ethan's mind. They sounded impossible. Throughout his career, money had solved nearly every obstacle: business permits, legal disputes, political access, private healthcare, exclusive schools. There had always been another door waiting to open. Tonight, for the first time in years, a door remained closed. Then Naomi Brooks stepped into the room. She checked Richard Blackwood's vital signs, adjusted his oxygen flow, spoke gently to reassure the frightened elderly man. Not once did she ask who Ethan was. Not once did she acknowledge his reputation. She treated Richard exactly the same way she treated every patient who entered the emergency department: with equal compassion, equal dignity, equal urgency. To Naomi, there were no billionaire patients, only human beings needing care. To Ethan, that quiet equality felt almost like disrespect. He interpreted professionalism as indifference, patience as defiance. Every calm sentence from Naomi seemed to challenge the world he had spent decades building. Outside, rain continued striking the hospital windows. Inside, tension spread through the corridor like invisible electricity. Doctors hurried between trauma rooms. Families prayed quietly in waiting areas. Security officers casually monitored the growing crowd. No one realized that within minutes, one impulsive decision would be captured by hospital surveillance cameras, witnessed by dozens of people, and forever change the lives of everyone standing in that emergency hallway. Least of all, the billionaire who still believed his wealth placed him beyond accountability. The sting on Naomi Brooks' cheek had not faded. A crimson handprint slowly appeared beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency department, impossible to ignore against her smooth, dark skin. Several nurses surrounded her immediately, their voices filled with concern. "Naomi, sit down. You need to be examined. Let someone else take over." Melissa reached gently for her friend's arm. "Please. You don't have to do this." Naomi took one slow breath. Then another. She briefly closed her eyes, not because she was weak, but because she needed one quiet second to steady both her heartbeat and the tiny life growing inside her. Instinctively, she rested her hand over her stomach. The baby kicked. A faint smile crossed her face. "I'm okay." Melissa shook her head. "No, you're not." Naomi looked at her with gentle eyes. "I will be." Before anyone could stop her, she turned back toward Richard Blackwood. The elderly man looked devastated. His breathing had become uneven, not because of his heart condition alone, but because of what he had just witnessed. He struggled to speak. "I'm so sorry." Naomi adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. "You don't need to apologize." His eyes filled with tears. "My son," she interrupted him softly. "Right now, you're my patient. And that's all that matters." Richard lowered his head. No one had ever answered him with such grace. Around them, the hallway remained unusually quiet. Doctors who had rushed from Trauma Bay 2 stood frozen for a moment. Patients waiting in wheelchairs watched silently. Even the security officers approaching from the entrance slowed their pace as they realized what Naomi had chosen to do. She could have walked away. Hospital policy fully supported removing herself from the situation after being assaulted. Instead, she reached for Richard's blood pressure cuff. The monitor beeped softly. His blood pressure had risen dangerously. "Mr. Blackwood," Naomi said gently. "I need you to focus on my voice." He nodded weakly. "Take a slow breath." He obeyed. "Good. Now another." She carefully adjusted the oxygen mask. Her movements remained calm, precise, almost graceful. Dr. Laura Bennett returned from Trauma Bay 2 just in time to witness the scene. She stopped beside Melissa. "Is she still treating him?" Melissa nodded. "I tried to stop her." Dr. Bennett looked at Naomi with quiet admiration. "She won't leave. Not while someone still needs her." Across the hallway, Ethan Blackwood remained motionless. For the first time since entering the hospital, uncertainty crept across his face. He had expected shouting, threats, lawsuits. Instead, the woman he had humiliated continued saving his father's life. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for that. His expensive watch suddenly felt meaningless. His tailored suit offered no protection from the uncomfortable weight settling inside his chest. Richard reached for Naomi's hand. She gently held it. "My wife," he whispered. She was a nurse. Naomi smiled softly. "She must have been wonderful." Richard nodded. "She always said, 'Kindness is the one thing people remember longest.'" Naomi looked into his tired eyes. She was right. Security officers finally reached Ethan. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Ethan didn't argue. He simply looked at Naomi one last time before allowing himself to be escorted toward the administrative offices. As he disappeared around the corner, he glanced back. Naomi wasn't watching him. She was adjusting his father's foreline, checking his pulse, speaking reassuring words to calm an elderly man who had done nothing wrong. The contrast struck everyone standing in that corridor. One person had used power to humiliate. The other had used compassion to heal. Hospital employees would remember that moment for years. Not because a billionaire had lost his temper, but because a pregnant nurse had refused to let someone else's cruelty change the kind of person she had chosen to become. Far away, inside a quiet federal courthouse, Judge Marcus Brooks had just finished his final hearing of the day. His phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. The caller ID read, "Melissa Carter, St. Matthew's Medical Center." Something deep inside him suddenly whispered that this ordinary phone call was about to change everything. Judge Marcus Brooks was reviewing the final documents of a sentencing hearing when his phone vibrated across the polished oak desk. The federal courthouse had grown unusually quiet as employees prepared to leave for the evening. Outside his office window, rain continued falling over downtown Chicago, washing the city lights into shimmering reflections across the streets below. Marcus rarely answered personal calls during work. But when he saw Melissa Carter's name appear on the screen, something inside him shifted. Melissa had worked beside Naomi for years. She never called unless it mattered. Marcus answered immediately. "Melissa?" For several seconds, she couldn't speak. He heard hurried footsteps. Hospital announcements echoed through the background. Then came a trembling voice. "Judge Brooks." "It's Naomi." Marcus slowly stood from his chair. "What happened?" Melissa struggled to steady her breathing. "A patient's family member. He assaulted her." Marcus froze. The room seemed to shrink around him. "What?" "He slapped her. In the emergency department." Marcus closed his eyes. His voice remained calm. "Is she hurt?" "Physically. She's all right." She checked on the baby. The doctors examined her. Everything looked stable. Marcus released a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "And Naomi?" Melissa's voice cracked. "She's still working." Marcus looked toward the rain-covered window. Still working. Of course she was. Even after everything. That single sentence described his younger sister better than anyone else ever could. "Who did it?" Melissa hesitated. "Ethan Blackwood." The name was familiar. One of the city's wealthiest developers. A man whose face regularly appeared on magazine covers and television interviews. Marcus had encountered Blackwood's legal team more than once during complex federal property disputes. He also knew Ethan's reputation. Brilliant. Powerful. Impatient. Marcus thanked Melissa quietly before ending the call. For several long seconds, he simply stood there. His office remained perfectly still. A framed family photograph rested on the bookshelf beside him. It showed two children standing in front of a modest brick house many years earlier. Marcus, 12 years old. Naomi, barely 6. She was missing one front tooth. He had one arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. Their mother had laughed while taking the picture. "Marcus," she had teased. "You act like you're responsible for your little sister." He remembered his answer perfectly. "I always will be." The memory struck him with unexpected force. Their parents had worked incredibly hard. Their father drove city buses. Their mother spent 28 years as a registered nurse. Neither parent cared about wealth. They cared about integrity. Every evening at dinner, their mother repeated the same lesson. Never use your position to make someone feel smaller. Marcus carried those words into law. Naomi carried them into medicine. He opened his desk drawer. Inside rested the small silver cross his mother had worn every day until she passed away. Marcus gently picked it up. For a brief moment, anger threatened to overwhelm him. Not because his sister had been insulted. Because someone had raised a hand against a pregnant nurse who had devoted her life to caring for strangers. He took one deep breath. Then another. Years on the federal bench had taught him that justice demanded discipline. Emotion could guide compassion. It could never guide judgment. Marcus placed the cross into his pocket, picked up his coat, turned off the lights in his office. As he walked through the nearly empty courthouse, security officers greeted him respectfully. "Good evening, Judge." He nodded politely. Outside, rain soaked the marble courthouse steps. His driver opened the car door. "Hospital," Marcus said quietly. The black sedan disappeared into the Chicago traffic. Back at St. Matthew's Medical Center, Naomi was finishing another patient assessment. The redness on her cheek had begun to fade. Her smile had not. She was explaining medication instructions to an elderly couple as though nothing extraordinary had happened. When she finished, Melissa approached. "Naomi, someone's here to see you." Naomi looked toward the emergency department entrance. A tall man in a dark overcoat had just stepped inside. Water dripped from the shoulders of his coat after the long drive through the rain. Their eyes met across the crowded hallway. Marcus didn't notice the doctors. He didn't notice the police officers reviewing surveillance footage. He didn't notice Ethan Blackwood sitting silently inside the administrative office. He saw only one thing: the faint outline of a handprint still visible on his little sister's cheek. And for the first time that evening, the quiet judge found himself struggling to hide the sorrow in his eyes. The emergency department had finally begun to settle. The rush of ambulances slowed. The crowded waiting room grew quieter as patients were admitted or discharged. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the hospital windows covered with tiny droplets that reflected the glow of Chicago's streetlights. Inside Trauma Bay 3, Richard Blackwood's condition had stabilized. His breathing was steady. His heartbeat had returned to a normal rhythm. For the first time that evening, Naomi Brooks allowed herself a moment to sit. She lowered herself carefully into a chair inside the staff break room, one hand instinctively resting over the gentle curve of her stomach. The baby moved. A small kick. Then another. Naomi smiled. "You've had quite a night, little one." A soft knock interrupted the silence. Marcus Brooks stepped into the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He looked at his younger sister. She looked exhausted. Her navy scrubs were wrinkled after hours of non-stop work. Her hair had begun falling loose from its bun. The red mark on her cheek had faded slightly, but it was still visible beneath the fluorescent lights. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Without saying a word, he walked toward her. Naomi stood. The two embraced quietly. It was the kind of hug only siblings who had shared a lifetime could understand. Marcus whispered softly, "Are you all right?" Naomi nodded against his shoulder. "I am." He leaned back and gently touched her cheek. "I'm sorry I wasn't here." She smiled faintly. "You are now." For several seconds, they simply stood together. The silence between them carried years of trust. Marcus finally spoke. "I've already spoken with hospital administration." Naomi looked at him. "I know. They've preserved the security footage." She nodded again. "I know. The police are investigating." "I know." Marcus took a slow breath. "I can make sure he answers for what he did." Naomi lowered her eyes. When she looked up again, her expression remained calm. "But why?" Marcus blinked. "Why? He assaulted you. In front of everyone. You're carrying a child. He should face every legal consequence." Naomi walked toward the window. Outside, the rainwater shimmered beneath rows of streetlights. "I don't want revenge." Marcus remained silent. She continued quietly. "I want accountability." "There's a difference." Marcus listened carefully. "If I spend my energy hating him, then he still controls part of my life." She placed both hands gently over her stomach. "I won't give him that." Marcus looked at his sister with quiet admiration. Their mother used to say those exact words. He hadn't heard them in years. Naomi turned back toward him. "What hurts the most isn't my cheek. It's knowing that someone believes another human being deserves less respect because of a uniform they wear." Marcus nodded slowly. "Nurses, teachers, police officers, janitors, anyone." She smiled gently. "Every job deserves dignity." Marcus looked toward the hallway outside the break room. Doctors hurried past. Custodians quietly mopped the floor. Volunteers pushed supply carts toward patient rooms. Each person carried invisible responsibilities that made the hospital function. Naomi spoke again. "I don't want people remembering tonight because a billionaire lost his temper." Marcus looked back at her. "I want them to remember that kindness didn't." The room became completely still. Marcus felt something inside him change. He had entered the hospital determined to protect his little sister. Now he realized. She was reminding him what justice truly looked like. Not anger, not vengeance, but truth guided by compassion. A gentle knock came at the door. Melissa peeked inside. "They're ready." Marcus nodded. He looked once more at Naomi. "No matter what happens next, I'm proud to be your brother." Naomi laughed softly. "And I'm proud to be your little sister." They walked out together. Not as a federal judge and a nurse. Simply as two siblings carrying the values their parents had spent a lifetime teaching them. Neither knew that beyond the conference room doors, Ethan Blackwood was waiting. For the first time in his life, The billionaire wasn't preparing an argument. He was preparing to face the truth. If this moment touched your heart, remember that true strength is not found in revenge, it is found in choosing dignity when bitterness would be easier. Asterisk, asterisk. The conference room on the second floor of St. Matthew's Medical Center had never felt so heavy. Outside, the emergency department continued operating as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Ambulances still arrived. Doctors still rushed between trauma rooms. Nurses continued comforting frightened families. Inside the conference room, however, time seemed to stand still. Ethan Blackwood sat alone at the far end of a polished wooden table. His expensive charcoal suit was still perfectly pressed, but the confidence that usually surrounded him had quietly disappeared. For the first time in years, no assistant stood beside him. No attorney whispered legal advice into his ear. No public relations consultant handed him carefully prepared statements. There was only silence. The hospital's chief executive officer, Margaret Ellis, entered first, followed by the director of nursing and 2 members of the hospital's legal department. A few moments later, the door opened again. Judge Marcus Brooks walked into the room. He wore a simple navy overcoat over his dark suit. No judicial robe. No security escort. No dramatic entrance. Yet the atmosphere shifted the instant he stepped inside. Ethan slowly looked up. Their eyes met. Something about the judge's calm expression unsettled him far more than anger ever could. Margaret Ellis spoke first. "Mr. Blackwood, thank you for waiting." Ethan nodded silently. She continued. "The hospital has completed an initial review of tonight's incident." She picked up a remote control. A large monitor on the wall came to life. Security camera footage filled the screen. The recording showed the emergency department exactly as it had happened. Naomi calmly explaining the triage process. Richard Blackwood lying quietly on the hospital bed. Doctors moving between trauma bays. Then, Ethan grabbing Naomi's wrist. The room remained silent. The video continued. Naomi asking him to let go. Melissa stepping forward. Then, the slap. It echoed through the conference room even louder than anyone remembered. No one spoke. The footage showed Naomi instinctively placing one hand over her unborn child before immediately turning back to care for Richard Blackwood instead of herself. Margaret stopped the video. The silence became almost unbearable. She looked directly at Ethan. "Our hospital has zero tolerance for violence against healthcare workers." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I understand." "For years," Margaret continued, "your company has generously supported our medical programs." She paused. "But donations do not purchase immunity." Judge Marcus Brooks remained completely silent. He hadn't interrupted once. That silence somehow carried more weight than any speech. Finally, Ethan looked toward him. "I didn't know." Marcus answered quietly. "No, you didn't." Ethan swallowed. "I didn't know she was your sister." Marcus looked at him steadily. Would it have mattered? The question struck Ethan like another slap. His mouth opened, then closed again. No answer came. Because both men already knew the truth. It shouldn't have mattered. Marcus folded his hands calmly. "My sister has never introduced herself as my sister. She earned every ounce of respect through her own work." He looked briefly toward the paused image of Naomi caring for Richard. "You struck a nurse. A pregnant nurse. Who continued treating your father after you assaulted her." Marcus's voice never rose. It didn't need to. Every word carried quiet authority. Ethan stared at the screen. For the first time, he truly watched Naomi's face after the assault. There was pain, shock, but no hatred. Only concern for his father. A deep shame settled over him. Not because powerful people now knew what he had done. Because he finally understood who Naomi Brooks truly was. Margaret Ellis slid another folder across the table. Multiple witnesses have submitted written statements. The surveillance footage has been preserved. The Chicago Police Department has opened its investigation. The hospital will fully cooperate. Ethan slowly nodded. "I won't fight it." The words surprised everyone in the room. Marcus studied him carefully. For the first time that evening, he saw something unfamiliar in the billionaire's eyes. Not arrogance. Not defiance. Regret. Real regret. Outside the conference room, Naomi quietly continued her shift, comforting a frightened child who had just arrived with a broken arm. She had no idea that, only a few doors away, the man who had humiliated her was finally discovering a truth far greater than her family name. He was discovering that real power was never measured by wealth, influence, or status. It was measured by the character of the person standing before you, especially when they chose compassion after being given every reason not to. 3 days after the incident, the auditorium inside St. Matthew's Medical Center was filled with an unusual mixture of emotions. Doctors stood beside nurses. Paramedics gathered near the back wall. Custodians, receptionists, volunteers, and hospital administrators quietly filled the seats. Television cameras waited outside the building, but none had been invited inside. This moment was not for publicity. It was for accountability. Naomi Brooks stood near the side of the stage, dressed in a simple light blue maternity dress beneath a white cardigan instead of her hospital scrubs. The faint bruise on her cheek had nearly disappeared, but the memory of that night still lingered in every corner of the hospital. She had returned to work the very next morning, exactly as she promised she would. Across the room, Ethan Blackwood waited alone. For the first time in decades, he had arrived without an assistant. Without bodyguards, without photographers, without the confidence that usually followed him into every room. His expensive tailored suit suddenly felt insignificant among people whose uniforms represented service instead of status. Margaret Ellis stepped onto the stage. The purpose of today's gathering, she began, is not to revisit anger. It is to remind ourselves what respect should look like. She invited Ethan forward. Every eye followed him as he slowly approached the podium. For several seconds, he simply stood there. The silence seemed almost unbearable. Finally, he looked toward Naomi. His voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard before. "Ms. Brooks, I spent most of my life believing success entitled me to more than other people." He paused. "I confused wealth with importance, and power with respect." The room remained completely still. He swallowed hard. "What I did to you was inexcusable. I humiliated someone whose entire job is helping strangers." His eyes briefly filled with emotion. "I cannot erase what happened, but I can admit that I was wrong." Then Ethan did something no one expected. He stepped away from the podium, walked directly toward Naomi, and stopped several feet away. Not close enough to invade her space. Not expecting forgiveness. Simply waiting. "I'm sorry." The words were quiet, but every person in the room heard them. Naomi looked at him for several long moments. She saw a man who looked older than he had only 3 days earlier. Not because time had passed, because humility had finally reached him. She stepped forward. "You owe me an apology." Ethan nodded. "I know, but..." She continued gently. "You owe something even bigger." He looked confused. "What is it?" Naomi glanced around the auditorium. At the nurses, the doctors, the janitors, the security officers. Every person who kept the hospital alive every single day. They deserve to feel safe while caring for others. Silence settled across the room. Naomi smiled softly. "I don't want your money. I don't want a private settlement. I don't even want revenge." She paused. "I want every healthcare worker who walks through these doors to know they'll be protected." Ethan lowered his head. "I understand. I've already spoken with the hospital board." He reached into his jacket and removed a folder. "My foundation will fund a permanent workplace safety and healthcare worker protection program." He placed the documents on the podium. "Training, security improvements, counseling services, legal support. No publicity, no naming rights, no conditions." The audience looked stunned. Margaret Ellis quietly reviewed the documents before smiling. "This will change lives." Naomi looked at Ethan. For the first time since the emergency room hallway, she smiled. Not because everything had been repaired. Some wounds needed time. But because someone had finally chosen responsibility over pride. Judge Marcus Brooks watched from the front row. His eyes met his sister's. Neither needed words. Their parents had always believed that justice wasn't complete when someone simply admitted guilt. Justice became meaningful when guilt inspired change. As the audience slowly rose to its feet, applause filled the auditorium. Not for the billionaire. Not even for Naomi. But for something far greater. The possibility that a single act of humility could begin healing damage that anger never could. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who believes that true respect is never demanded. It is earned through humility, accountability, and the courage to choose kindness over pride. Asterisk asterisk. 6 months later, spring had returned to Chicago. The bitter winds of winter had given way to warm sunshine, and the trees lining the streets outside St. Matthew's Medical Center were covered with fresh green leaves. The city felt alive again. Sidewalk cafes were busy, children laughed in nearby parks, and the hospital entrance buzzed with its familiar rhythm of ambulances, visitors, and healthcare workers beginning another day. Inside the maternity wing, sunlight poured gently through wide windows, filling the quiet room with a soft golden glow. Naomi Brooks sat comfortably in a chair beside the hospital bed, cradling her newborn daughter in her arms. The tiny girl slept peacefully, wrapped in a pale pink blanket, her tiny fingers curled around Naomi's thumb. Naomi smiled down at her. "You'll grow up in a world that isn't perfect," she whispered softly. "But I promise you'll always know what kindness looks like." A gentle knock came at the door. "Come in." Judge Marcus Brooks stepped inside carrying a bouquet of white lilies. The moment he saw his niece, his usually composed expression melted into a warm smile. "So," he laughed quietly, "this is the little fighter." Naomi grinned. "She definitely gets that from her uncle." Marcus shook his head. "I hope she gets your heart." He carefully lifted the baby into his arms. For a long moment, neither brother nor sister spoke. They simply admired the tiny new life sleeping peacefully between them. Their mother had often said that every child entered the world carrying hope. Standing there, Marcus finally understood what she meant. Another knock interrupted the quiet moment. Margaret Ellis entered first. Behind her stood several nurses from the emergency department. Melissa carried a small gift bag decorated with tiny pink ribbons. "You didn't think we'd let you celebrate without us, did you?" She laughed. The room quickly filled with smiles. Hugs. Congratulations. Laughter echoed gently through the hallway. Then the door opened once more. The room became silent. Ethan Blackwood stood quietly in the doorway. He wasn't wearing an expensive business suit. Instead, he wore a simple navy blazer without a tie. There were no photographers, no assistants, no security team. Only a small wrapped gift held carefully in both hands. He stopped several feet inside the room. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Naomi looked toward Marcus. Marcus gave a slight nod. She smiled gently. "Please, come in." Ethan approached slowly. He placed the gift on a nearby table. "I didn't come to stay long. I just wanted to congratulate you." Naomi thanked him quietly. Ethan looked toward the sleeping baby. "She's beautiful." There was another brief silence. Then Ethan spoke again. "The hospital safety program is already operating." Margaret nodded proudly. "In just 6 months, we've expanded security training, added crisis response teams, and created counseling services for healthcare workers." Melissa smiled. "And incidents involving staff have already decreased." Ethan looked back at Naomi. "You were right." She tilted her head slightly. "About what?" "Real change matters more than winning." Naomi smiled. "I hoped you'd discover that for yourself." He nodded. "I did. And it changed me far more than losing ever could." After saying goodbye, Ethan quietly left the room. No applause followed him. No dramatic music. Only silence. The peaceful kind that comes when something finally ends the way it should. Later that afternoon, Naomi stood beside the hospital window holding her daughter close. Far below, nurses hurried through the entrance. Doctors greeted patients. Custodians swept the sidewalks. Security officers smiled as children visiting family members walked through the front doors. Ordinary people, doing extraordinary work. Marcus joined her at the window. "What are you thinking?" Naomi looked at the busy hospital below. I'm thinking, my daughter will grow up seeing that greatness isn't measured by money. Marcus smiled. No, it's measured by character. Outside, the sunlight reflected from the hospital's glass entrance, illuminating hundreds of people walking through its doors with hope, compassion, and quiet determination. Naomi gently kissed her daughter's forehead. Some stories end with revenge. Some end with victory. But the stories people remember the longest are the ones where compassion proves stronger than pride. And as the camera slowly pulled away from the hospital, the sounds of newborn laughter, distant footsteps, and the steady heartbeat of a city caring for one another faded gently into silence. The end.